church benches and into the trenches. Let's make a righteous ruckus.
Hey, this is Riley Lowe, your congenial, convivial, something host and of today's podcast. This is the Righteous Ruckus podcast. And I'm going to get into, I teased it a little bit last week, how I want to get into a comparison and an application between Gideon and Samson, right? Gideon and Samson. Some of you might be, thinking about this and be like, oh yeah, well, they're both judges, but other than that, who cares, right? Who cares? Well, I want to talk about the similarities. They were both judges, and let's talk about the differences in the way they responded, to the calling of God. I want to talk about that, and then kind of talk about a little bit of application of our lives. So let's get into it. So Gideon, a lot of people are really familiar with most of the story of Gideon. Actually, he was just kind of a lowly guy. And he was a wheat farmer, right? I can kind of relate to that. I grew up around a lot of wheat farming, where I grew up in my formative years. I actually worked for a neighboring wheat farmer from where we lived through high school, pretty much. And it's interesting. So he was a wheat farmer, and a lot of people know the story. I mean, there's a little bit of the backstory here, but. So basically, he was a farmer, and he lived during a time when the Midianites, they would come up and basically they didn't do much of their own hunting and gathering, if you will. They just went and raided the Israelites and took what they had and took it for their own, right? And so Gideon was when God called him, he was actually in a wine press, the threshing wheat. So he was taking wheat, throwing it up in the air, and letting the wind. Usually the wind is what blows the chaff away, and the kernels, the seeds, fall to the ground, and you can gather them up. He was doing this in a wine press because he was fearful of the Midianites. And then an angel of the Lord comes to him and says, look, dude, I'm going to use you. This is paraphrasing, of course. Like most of the times when I say stuff like that, this is paraphrasing on this podcast. So this angel of the Lord's like, look, dude, I'm going to use you to raise up a great army, and we're going to go destroy the Midianites. And this is going to be a really good deal. And he's like, all right. And then he says, well, how can... What's he say there? Here he says, this is in Judges 6, 15 and 16, this little excerpt here. It says, pardon me, Lord, Gideon replied, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. The Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. You will strike down the Midianites. Now, interesting side note there. So is that in the end, he didn't even have to strike down any of the Midianites. They struck down themselves, but his faithfulness is what allowed this to happen. So basically the story of Gideon, as most of y'all know. So Gideon, he's God says, all right, you're going to do this. And he's like, I don't know. You sure about this? He says, okay, if God, let me know for sure. This is, man, so many of us can identify with this, right? Because he's like, God, if this is really you telling me to do this. Now, he saw an angel. He was face to face with an angel telling him, and then he's like, well, it sounds like a really cool deal. But if you're with, prove to me, God, prove to me that this is you. And if it is, then when I wake up in the morning, let all the ground have dew on it, but let this fleece, this sheep's fleece, right, this wool, be dry. He wakes up the next day, sure enough, it happens. He's like, okay, great, you're in it, God. But to really show that you're in it, let the fleece be wet tomorrow morning and the ground be dry. So So it happens, and he's like, all right, well, I guess I got to do this now. I guess God really is in this thing. And that's how so many of us act. I do that all the time. It's it's like, you can feel God drawing you to do something, to step out to do something. And it's like, are you sure? God, are you sure about this? Because I can't really see this working. I can't see the end game from where I'm standing. Are you sure? Just like Gideon said, when he says, my clan is the weakest. Like, I don't come from a family of notoriety and wealth and prominence. I come from just a normal family, just an average family. And he's actually saying he comes from the least family, the smallest family, and he's the weakest of all of them. Or his clan's the weakest, and he's the least in them. So he's the weakest of the weak, right? If, there's that saying that what the chain's only as strong as the weakest link. He's saying that he is basically the weakest link in all of Israel. That's what he's saying. And he just can't see, how can God use him? And a lot of times God uses those types of people. God uses that. Now, so then what he does is he goes and he gets a bunch of people together and gets an army together. And it's actually he gets an army of, I think, 30. Let me double check here. He gets an army of 32,000, right? And gathered up, and he's getting ready to go into battle. And he's like, and then God says, well, you got too many people. If you go up against the Midianite army, which actually was 135,000 people, that's still pretty bleak odds, right? So, but God says, no, if you do it with all these guys, then you guys are going to think it was you and not me that did this. And so Gideon follows the instructions and says, hey, if anybody doesn't feel like they want to fight and they want to go home, you can go home. Like 20,000 people leave. And so then he says, okay, God tells them, well, nope, still too many. And so then he tells them, go drink water from a stream. He says, any of them that get down on their hands and knees can go home, but any of them that's cup the water in their hand and lap it up like a dog, then that's the ones that are going into battle. And it winds up being 300 people, right? Hollywood made a movie of 300, and it was just these odds, and there's such fierce fight. Well, here's the actual real story of 300 people and 300 soldiers. And anyway, so God actually gives them into Gideon's hand, and Gideon and a buddy actually go down there and listen at night to the Midianite camp. And the Midianites are like, man, I had this dream, and Gideon's army is going to take us out. This is just not good. And so he knew they were terrified. And so what they did is they all got clay pots. No, they had torches, right? They had torches, and then they lit the torch, and they had a clay pot over it, and then he has them spread out and basically surround this camp. And in those days, it would have been the leaders of your group, your battle group, whether it's a battalion or whatever it's called. Anyway, your battle group that would have been carrying the torch to lead the group. And so these Midianites are sleeping in the camp, and the Israelites surround them. They all break the pot, and they blow the trumpets. And the Midianites wake up in the middle of the night. It's completely dark, and all they see is torches surrounding them. And they're thinking that's not one person with each of the torches. They're thinking that's one person with like 10,000 people behind them or something like that, or 100 people or whatever it is, the number behind. They're thinking we are way outnumbered and we're surrounded and we're being destroyed right now. And actually God caused them to start attacking each other, and they wound up basically wiping most of them out, and the rest of them ran away, and they all chased them down and killed them, dispatched of them. So Gideon wound up being, and actually they wanted to make Gideon king after that. And he's like, no, man, no, this was just God. So God was able to use a guy that was like I'm nothing, man. I'm the lowest of the low. I'm the weakest of the weak. I'm the smallest of the small. And God was able to use him to inspire a group of people and lead a group of people and to do God's will. And I mean, it's the greatest bluff in military history, right? You got 300 guys that basically scared 135,000 guys into killing themselves. I mean, that's very, very, very impressive. And then let's look at Samson. Now, a lot of people know Samson. You know, he's big, strong, right? So basically, his parents were told by an angel beforehand to commit him to be a Nazirite and have follow this Nazirite vow beforehand. And Samson ends up, this guy was, and they told him, they said, your son is going to lead. Well, here it is. This is Judges 13:5. You will become pregnant and have a son whose head is never to be touched by a razor, because the boy is to be a Nazirite, dedicated to God from the womb. He will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines. He will take the lead. This guy, the feats of strength mentioned in the Bible that are attributed to Samson are, he's basically a, real life superhero. The Hulk or Superman or whatever you want to call him. He is an impressive individual. But he takes this vow, he's committed to this vow, but he ends up breaking the vow, not following the vow. He's sleeping with women, he's sleeping with prostitutes. Like, he's just following the lusts of the world. And he knows, God's with him through a lot of this. This is where, I would think this would lead to, the argument that a backsliding Christian can still be a Christian can still be a Christian, even though they're struggling, because Samson kind of did that too. But anyway, it ends up being this Delilah, who was just this another chick. He gets married, and then he just runs off and does whatever he wants to, and then he gets mad that the Philistines had married off this chick, his wife, to another guy. Anyway, the whole story is kind of crazy. It's really an interesting thing to read about. But Samson winds up, of course, chasing Delilah. The guy is just like, hey, I want this chick, bring her to me. I mean, these days would be, well, I never thought this would come to my mind and be used in the podcast. People would be crying about toxic masculinity. That's what they would be saying. Samson is just toxic masculinity, right? Maybe that's the beginning of it. I just have visions in my head of those liberals, out there just screaming just to scream. But in any event, Samson just does what he wants, takes what he wants. Of course, the famous story is he killed 1,000 men with a donkey, or the jawbone of a fresh jawbone of a donkey. In other words, a freshly killed donkey was laying there. He grabs the jawbone, kills 1,000 Philistines with this thing. And this guy was built. He was built for battle, right? He was huge. He could do anything. I mean, if he would have applied himself, he could have led. I mean, imagine the inspiration of a guy like Samson leading your army. Come on, guys, look what I can do. You're with me. I mean, talk about inspiration. But Samson just squandered it, man. He just squandered. He's one of them. It's a story of what could have been. How amazing this guy could have been. And this is the comparison. Now, I mean, he ends up redeeming himself when he is at the lowest of his lows. He's been captured because he was pompous and confessed to this chick he was running around with that his weakness would be if they were to cut his hair. And then, but he winds up getting his eyes gouged out, and he's treading grain like just a beast of burden, like a oxen, for the king of the Philistines. And they end up just kind of having him being a circus clown at the end, and they want him to come out and be like a trained circus clown to show off for everybody as a kind of a trophy. And they have 3,000 people in this temple and on the roof, and he can't see anything, but he can feel his way around, and they have him. He says, "Hey, put me over by this pillar so I can rest." And he realizes it, and he pushes the pillars out. The building comes down. He kills 3,000 of them. Now that's it. Now, when you look at the story of Samson by itself, that ending is like, wow. This guy killed 3,000 people by himself because he was so strong. Well, here's the thing, and this is what I want you to take. This guy, think he killed 3,000 people. Now, he killed 1,000 people with the jawbone of a donkey. He did that many with that. And so just look at talk about, like, if he was here today, it'd be he could be some kind of ultimate fighter guy that, just ridiculous physical specimen that's capable of doing anything physical. He would be a decathlon gold medal winner. He would be doing he'd just be doing it all. It'd be whatever. He'd be the Bo Jackson today. It'd be Samson instead of Bo Jackson, right? Any sport he touched, he would dominate. And so, the sad thing is, Samson was built for that and promised he will take the lead in delivering Israel from the hands of the Philistines. Now, basically, all he did was begin the process. He could have, if he would have been committed and been dedicated to that goal that he knew was his, and God was with him. He knew God was with him. But yet, instead of spending the 20 years that he was a judge dominating the Philistines and wiping them out and delivering the Israelites, he decides to go chase some women and do things like that, and basically chase the lusts of life. He chased the lusts of life. Man, what it makes me think of is how many people do you know that you've seen? Like I remember before, I ran across a guy, it's been years ago. He was working at a Radio Shack. Remember back when there used to be a Radio Shack around? Some of you people may not even know what Radio Shack is. Well, there was a Radio Shack in a town that I lived in. I went in there, and this guy had a voice. It was like this bass voice that just filled the store. And he was just a guy that would check you out. He was just a cashier guy. He would give you advice, or he'd sign you up for a cell phone plan or whatever. But this guy had this huge voice, and just a regular voice. He sounded like, you're like, if this guy was talking about a car, I want to buy that car. Whatever this guy is talking about, this guy has this gift of this wonderful oratory tone that just sucked you in, basically. You're just like, wow. And I asked him, I said, you mind me asking? I said, have you ever considered a job in radio or something along those lines? And he laughed and he said, yeah. He said, man, everybody tells me that, He said, I've thought about it, but, I just don't know. But man, yeah, everybody asks me that. And I'm like, you've got this gift, it's almost a shame that you're to not use that gift for everybody, and let everybody enjoy that gift. And that's kind of Samson. He's just born with this just gift, and he kind of squanders. I'm not saying the guy was squandering his gift at Radio Shack, but he's trying to figure out his way. He's just going along the way, working at Radio Shack, while he could have easily been having an incredible career, being a preacher or being on a radio or doing something along those lines. Because, man, I'm talking about grabbing your attention and having you listen. If that guy, I mean, you wouldn't have to be hearing me drone on and on. You would hear this guy. And so how many times are the people that are just blessed and gifted with this almost superhuman talent in me, and they just squander it. Think of, I don't know if there's any football fans. I know football's starting back up, but like Terrell Owens was probably he played for the 49ers, and I think he played for the Eagles, the NFL player, right, wide receiver. This guy, he was faster than everybody. He was bigger than everybody, and he could catch like no other. And this guy, I mean, and he was a specimen to behold. Terrell Owens was, but he just had this ego where he just thought he could just do whatever he wanted and he could still be the best. Well, you gotta have discipline to balance out that ego. He believed he was the best, and I honestly think he had the potential to be the greatest wide receiver to ever play the game, if not just the greatest football player to ever play the game. He was, wow, I mean, incredible. And I wasn't even a 49ers fan or a Cowboys fan or an Eagles fan. It's something to admire. And then you take some people, like let's look at if we're going to stick with football analogies, kind of like a Kurt Warner, somebody like that comes to mind, where he was passed over. I think he played, or maybe like a Doug Flutie even. I think both those guys actually went to Canadian football leagues, and before they come into the NFL. You're kind of passed over, forgotten. I'm the least of the least. I'm mediocre, man. I'll just try to keep my head down and do my thing, and and then they become like Kurt Warner I believe he was Super Bowl champion. Eventually. And this is a guy that the scouts passed over, couldn't get a job, and he ends up winning the Super Bowl. Right? It's along those lines where you look at those two people. You look at somebody like me, for instance. I'm telling you, for me, if this doesn't inspire you, I've mentioned before on this podcast, I never thought I would do a podcast. I never thought I would be speaking to tens and tens of people, right? I never thought I'd do that. And I mean, when you break it down, I mean, really, if you look at this podcast, you look at the total numbers. If each one of those is a unique person, it's been thousands of people. Now imagine if all those thousands of people were in one church and I was preaching to that church. I mean, this podcast platforms have given me the ability to affect the lives of more people than if I was just in one church, right? Because I don't come, I haven't gone to seminary. I don't come from my dad wasn't a preacher. My family wasn't a line of preachers. I don't have a prominent position in the Christian influential circles, right? But yet here I am, and I believe God has positioned me in this. Now a lot of times it's been through tragedy. Think about Gideon, where he was hiding in the wine press because of all the dangers around. Now there's that tragedy of, obviously he'd probably been raided before, and those tragedies has caused him to be a little bit apprehensive. But when he felt the call of God, he spoke with an angel of God face to face. He said, all right, well, and he even like, I don't know, God, I don't know. And then with the fleece thing, he's like, all right, I guess I'm going to do this deal. And that was, I can identify with that a lot. I'm definitely not, I don't have the best speaking voice, the best speaking talent. I'm not what is that guy, Tony Robinson or whatever, one of them. That's like a Samson analogy there. You got those guys, I don't even know if that's the right guy. Anyway, there's some of them motivational speakers, and they cuss and they do whatever and they try to get you going, right? And I'm like, look at this talent, these guys that have such an influence and this talent of being able to speak eloquently and convincingly in front of an audience, and they're using it just to be like, hey, you do you. You gotta pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and you can do that. Instead of being like, hey, let's think eternally here, right? And so it's just like that though. How God uses the weakest of the weakest group to accomplish His goals, though, and it's really, it makes it to where when you see people who are not just immediately blessed from birth with these great skills and these great abilities, and those people are able to influence the lives of others, that's not them. That's not them. That's the Holy Spirit that's working through them, that's doing all the work. Because that's the reality is, if somebody's being influenced at all by this podcast, it's not by my words, it's not by my actions, it's by the word, and it's by the action of the Holy Spirit. And that's what I want to encourage you is all you got to do is just say, yes, Lord, yes. And you can be used by God as a tool, and you don't got to worry about it because it's not you. If somebody says, you say, hey, what do you know about Jesus? Or can I tell you my story? And somebody says no, then it's not you that they're shutting down. It's the Holy Spirit that they're rejecting. So it makes rejection that much easier too. So the whole thing is to, whether you are a Samson who is just blessed with all sorts of skills, which I know a ton of people that are, and or if you're a Gideon that thinks you're the lowest of the low, don't make the mistakes of Samson, and don't make the mistakes, even though they were a little bit less mistakes, of Gideon, but just step out immediately in faith and let God use you.